starting and seeing where it goes. Thank you, Eric, and welcome. So, what is medical gaslighting? I think I best introduce myself first so that you have an idea of how I come to be the person to tell you about this tonight. Um, as you've gathered, my name is Anneke. That's how it's pronounced in Dutch. I'm quite used to people calling me Anneke in English. It's a slightly different sound. Quite happy with that. I'm actually originally from Belgium. I lived here until I was 17. I had my 18th birthday in the United Kingdom, in England, where I moved on my own at the age of 17. And I did my studies there. I became an occupational therapist and worked as such for about 5 years, and then did a postgrad in health research. But I had health issues throughout my life, and they were weird things. My primary diagnosis was always exhaustion, but there were odd things going on in my body that seemed disconnected. Um, and there were no real answers. Nobody was connecting the dots at that stage. And it took until about 10 years ago, so I'm 51 now, I was in my late 30s to mid 40s when I got my real diagnoses, um, which were adrenal insufficiency was the first thing that was discovered. Lupus was discovered later, a few weeks later, but that is very well under control now. Um, and then a few years later came a diagnosis of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I won't go on about those too much because that's not the essence of this talk. We can do that later if anybody's interested. But just so you get an idea of the timing, I had been ill all my life, and it was in my late 30s that I got my first, what I call real proper diagnosis. Before that, I'd spent 20 years with a diagnosis of ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. Initially, it was ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, that got changed. It was the same condition, but got called chronic fatigue syndrome a while later, and then eventually the two got combined, and it was ME/CFS. Um, and I really always had the help of psychologists or other such therapists. Um, and it's kind of everybody can find things to discuss with a psychologist. Life is like that. We've all been through things that are less pleasant, difficult to cope with. We can all learn a lot about ourselves. So I was willing to do that. And I went along. They suggested all sorts of psychological constructs that caused my exhaustion, while I was dealing with other things that went wrong with my body, like sprains and infections and multifarious things, stomach problems, bowel troubles. Um, but that seemed to be separate. It wasn't part and parcel. I was really exhausted because there was something wrong with my mind, with my character. It was a figment of my imagination, or I was exaggerating. I wasn't dealing with it well. I was doing too little. I was doing too much. All those kind of things. And it was really only in the last few years that I kept talking. After 10 years ago, roughly speaking, getting real diagnoses, I'll keep calling it that. If that doesn't fit for some of you, translate it to whatever you need it to be. I think you understand what I mean. Um, during those 10 years, I still had psychological support and I needed it. And I kept coming back to this. I kept coming back to how do I know when it's about who I am rather than about something physically wrong with me? How do I know when I need to call in medical help? All those kind of things, a lot of self doubt, sometimes dangerously so. And I talk to therapists about this, to psychologists about this, and I eventually got around to saying, but actually, what I went through was abuse. It was abuse by people in professions, who were responsible for my care, my medical care. And I struggled with that. And meanwhile, this word gaslighting seemed to come up in social media in particular, but elsewhere as well. And it tended to be used in terms of relationships, in terms of narcissism and toxicity within relationships. And going over and over and over this again, in one of the sessions with the psychologist, I thought, well, actually, that was gaslighting, what was done to me. I had learned what it meant. Because for a long time I read about it in, as I say, uh, relationships particularly, but I didn't really understand what it was. I understood it was something nasty, but I didn't quite get the concept until I saw an interview with Stephen Fry. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Stephen Fry, but he was talking about a film called Gaslight. And it's an old film, it's a black and white movie in which I'm going to relate what I have recalled. So it may not be exact. Um, perhaps I should have done a bit more research, but I've done what I could to prepare for this session. So I want to convey the essence. And the essence was that it was about a couple and they lived in a house that was lit by gaslight. And the gaslight was regulated up in the attic. And the husband would go up in the attic and fiddle with the gaslighting so that when he wasn't there, because it was up in the attic, or he would go up and do this and then disappear out of the house, presumably, the lights would flicker. But whenever he was present, they didn't. And so when his wife said something wrong with the lights, maybe something's going on, he could prove that it was a figment of her imagination. There clearly wasn't anything wrong. And she started to question her own sanity. So that's where the term gaslighting comes from, and that's what it means in relationships. And when I was talking again with a psychologist about all these things that had been said and done to me, I connected the two. I thought, well, you could call that medical gaslighting. And then it kind of dawned on me, I think I might have heard those two connected before. Perhaps there already is such a term as medical gaslighting. Let's look that up. So I typed in medical gaslighting, and I'll be very honest, I didn't. I looked at it for a very brief time because it was overwhelming. I have come in the last few months only to learn just how widespread and how vicious it can be. Now, typically, I'm not saying solely, I'm saying typically, it happens for people who are chronically ill because they stay ill over a long time, and often there's not yet an explanation, and often things aren't even investigated because they remain ill anyway, no matter what you try. So it will be their fault. It happens typically in conditions which are, I always put almost in brackets before I write this down, almost invisible. And many conditions are that you feel it, but you can't show anything for it. You can say, oh, I feel really ill, or I've got a really bad headache. if your leg's in a plaster, you can in a cast, you can say, "I broke my leg," and you've got something to show for it. In fact, I remember it just reminds me of something that happened to me when I was asked by a relative stranger. He was one of my neighbours, and he passed and had a chat, you know, when he passed, and I happened to be outside. And so one day he was asking about how I was, and I wasn't very well, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, "Do you need to take any medication for that?" Now, by that stage, I was on a lot of medication. I was on painkillers, antacids, things against infections, multifarious things were being tried. Um, and I showed him my box with the medication in, and I could see, but he also said it, but I could see in his face that all of a sudden I was seriously ill, you know, without even knowing what was in those boxes, because really it was relatively mild. It was the kind of, suppress the symptoms to help her keep going. And I was lucky to have doctors who did that, to have a really, really good family practitioner. I was back in Belgium by then. I returned to Belgium after I did my postgrad whilst I was working, which really isn't a particularly good idea when you're that short of energy already. But really, it broke me, and I moved back to Belgium to be closer to family and old friends. Um, I had hoped I would be less isolated here. My health was very isolating. I'd gone on incapacity. Um, and I was convinced that the Belgian health service was better. I learned that the social service is better. It was, in those days, better in England. But the health service really was a higher notch. And I knew the health service in England inside and out because I'd worked inside it and I had been using it. Um, Chronic, invisible. The other one is rare diseases. Because how can any doctor be expected to think of every condition that has ever been known to man, let alone be open to those that haven't yet been discovered? Um, and if they don't find the answers, it would take so much effort. Hello, Isabel and Robert. Thank you for joining us. It's people are coming on, and I'm actually seeing the comments come in. I'm so pleased with that. Um, but it may distract me every now and again, so forgive me. Um, Rare diseases, yes. So I've said chronic, invisible, and rare. Rare for that reason. It is a bit too much to expect that things are always discovered in time. What isn't too much to expect, as I see it, is that the patient is respected and that care is given to the best of someone's ability. And sometimes it is a case of luck of happening upon that doctor or that fellow patient who knows about it and who can steer you in the right direction. I accept that. Um, what I do not accept is the victim blaming. Um, and the victim blaming is serious. And what I did purposefully for this talk, I'm writing this book, the memoir, my life story around medical gaslighting. That will have my story in detail. If I tell you all that tonight, you won't buy my book, but you still might not. You're free to do so. But since I've been writing that and since I started the page, so many people have contacted me, and I've read a lot in other groups, and sometimes I write a comment and it involves medical gaslighting and then people respond. Whew. I have enough material, and I've asked all the examples I will use have been entrusted to me by other people. And if it is about me, I will tell you. But I have permission. But some are so general that they're so repeated. So many people have experienced this that it's really heartbreaking. And so a typical one is um, it seems to happen more to women. Again, not solely, but more. Um, and we get told it's your hormones. Whatever it is you're complaining about, it's your hormones. And I've actually, somebody wrote to me that she was literally told it's because you're female. Um, Another one that I think just about everybody that has suffered medical gaslighting has heard, or at least has had implied to them, is it's in your head. And that's the term that people refer to when they refer to their lack of confidence about themselves afterwards, or even on the day of getting a real diagnosis. Oh, hang on, but it's in my head. It can't be, it's in my head. That seems to be the phrase that really, really sticks. One person wrote that doctors made unpleasant and scandalous remarks. They didn't go on to detail those, but I've got a fairly good idea what they might have covered. People are being called dramatic, weak, lazy, they've given up. I mean, the mere fact that you bother to go to a therapist and ask for help should prove that that statement is wrong, if you ask me. But no, you're told you've given up. Um, it's all due to a fear of exercise or a fear of activity. Um, it really is psychological abuse by doctors and by therapists. I need to add that. It's very important. For me, it was things like I was put on a heart rate monitor by one consultant. I was told by a psychiatrist that I only wore it to use it as a symbol towards my friends to make sure that they knew that I really was ill. I had a heart rate monitor. I was told that really patients with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, you really shouldn't be prescribed a wheelchair or anything like that because they really like being dependent so much. Those are just two examples. I won't give you too many because I'll spoil the book. But it actually goes beyond that. It goes beyond doctors and therapists and the health professionals because it becomes integrated in the culture. We already have a victim blaming culture across the board, not just in terms of health. Um, but one of the things that I received from other patients was their problem with unsolicited advice. And it's okay to give advice. Don't get me wrong. I I'm just distracted because there's an important comment here from Tina saying the fear does comes not from exercise but from the pain afterwards. And I thought I was broken as the pain was so much after minuscule exercise. And I concur with that. I had exactly the same experience, still do, except I have learned ways in a positive way. I have learned to overcome that largely, but not totally. And I will come back to that later. Indeed, and when I was given that same comment, because as I say, the same things get repeated with different patients. It really isn't tailor made. This fits you. This is how I'm going to help you. It's you've got MECFS. You must be frightened of activity, and I could come up with various examples of then how come when I know I'm going to a wedding, I rest in advance. I make sure that my diary is empty for weeks afterwards so that I can rest up because I know I will be broken, but I will be dancing because I like dancing. If I'm that fearful of it, I should just stay at home. And then I was told I would never get well because I was too resistive to therapy. So, what I was saying, unsolicited advice came up regularly um, among the comments and the testimonies that I received from various people. And giving advice is okay. We all have different experience in life. There might, one of you might have the answer. The thing is, the unsolicited bit, I may not be ready to hear you. And if I'm not ready to hear you, I won't. So you might as well not bother. And if I say I'm not ready to hear you, that minimum of respect is particularly important to people who've suffered medical gaslighting. Um, but also, if you give advice, it's advice. It's not an order. It's advice. I do with it as I please. I will weigh up whether that's advice that I want to follow or not. But what happens in our victim blaming culture is that it becomes a you didn't try hard enough because you didn't do what I told you to do. You haven't tried the advice that I've given you. And I've got a list, but I'm going to share the one that I was told that I think is the best of all the unsolicited advice I've been given was from somebody who was a complete stranger to me. We met at a car boot sale. She happened to be on the stall opposite where I was, and we started talking because I'm one of these people who talks to everybody and anybody. And she told me I had to drink charcoal and that would heal me. So I went to the chemist and I wasn't intending on buying charcoal, but I did want to know what is this about. So I asked, and apparently it's used when people overdose, used to help empty the stomach, but in other quantities, I assume, it's apparently can be good in particular problems with digestion. Um, but I've got a list here of some of the things that people get told. Go outside more is a very typical one. Do more exercise. Try yoga. Try some affirmations. And another particularly good one, I have to say, it's from someone else, was have you tried worrying less? Yep, I see this as ringing true amongst you. Okay, so um, there is an undercurrent there, and it's twofold. One is I can heal you, so therefore I can heal you by something that is, easy to come by, and you're refusing to do it. Um, so there's that guilt thing of it's your responsibility to heal yourself, and you're choosing not to. But also that the condition isn't real, that the complaints that you're presenting with don't have a strong physical foundation. And someone wrote, and I will quote them, well-meaning folks do harm when trying to show care. And I think that's a really important one to remember. Now, in line with that, I would love, if you're up for it, to share with you one of the poems I wrote when long before I had my diagnoses that I shared with you that proved that the initial diagnosis was wrong. And I was struggling with exactly the unsolicited advice things and stuff like that. So it's slightly aside from the medical gaslighting, but it's very closely related, in my opinion. Um, and it's called Failing to Be Grateful. I have no idea if you can still see me, because I've gone to a different tab, but I'll read you it. I used to know these things by heart, but I don't want to make any mistakes. So it's called Failing to Be Grateful. I'm on capacity now, I answer. Oh, is that good? You ask. It's all right, but I'd rather have my life back. I don't know what to say. It's shit, you say. Ring me any time you need to talk, you say. Well, thanks, but I'd rather have my life back. Can I take you out for a ride, you say. It will get you out of the house, you say. And it does. But I'd rather have my life back. You've got so much courage. You're so strong, you say. Strength takes on many different forms, you say. You may be right, but I'd rather have my life back. Have you thought of, you say. Perhaps if you say. Couldn't you? You say. Why don't you? You say. Hadn't you better? You say, while I struggle on, trying to get some of my life back. Now, luckily, I did get some of my life back, and we'll come to that later. But first, I had to go through the consequences of medical gaslighting, as again do many others. And again, the list largely applies to me because it is generalized. It applies to just about anyone who has been victim to medical gaslighting, but it's composed again of the things that I have read from others too. So I haven't done a proper health research project on this. I would love to, but I'm not sure I have the capacity anymore to do that. I may, you never know where these things lead. It, but people do send me stuff, and I read it and I take it to heart, and so that's where this list comes from. The most important consequence is that you start to question your own sanity. And that, of course, is the definition of gaslighting. That's its purpose. You question your own sanity. Now, I do believe that many of the doctors and the therapists that I came across. I'm distracted again. Thank you for the compliments on the poem. And again, I can see that it rings true. And I'm sorry for that. I'd much rather I would have been the only one to ever go through that, frankly. Yeah, questioning your own sanity is the very definition of gaslighting. And what I was saying was that I do believe that a lot, not all, but a lot of the people that used this with me were actually convinced that they were helping me. That was the culture. That was what they were taught to do. So what happens is that confidence in your own mind and in the messages of your own body takes a nosedive. Actually, it doesn't happen all that quickly. It happens over time because I, I, I can only speak for myself in this. I'm aware of that. I actually joined up because I had this idea that maybe they're right. What if they are? If they are right, then I can gain control over this. And I would have done anything to gain control over the symptoms I was suffering. And it didn't work. And so I was doing something wrong and I had to dig deeper. And so on, and so on, and so on. And that went on for 20 years, where I actually signed up for this. I wanted to find the switch. So, yeah, the confidence in what your own mind is doing, but also in what your body is telling you. Maybe I do feel pain that isn't there. And I actually learnt over time. I'm proud of this, you can tell. I learnt over time to, when that was suggested, I would question in return would be, does that make me any less ill? If I'm imagining all this pain, all this exhaustion, all these things going wrong with my body, surely there's something seriously wrong with me that is deserving of care. I add that. a lot of people who have written to me, and I've adopted it, but it didn't come from me, um, about imposter syndrome. I, I have it. I still have it. I haven't freed myself of that. And what happens is that even a few years ago, I fell flat on my face. Everything in my body went forward, and my feet stayed put. Don't ask. I don't know how. The ambulance people asked me what had happened. Did you trip? Did you get dizzy? No, my feet stayed and I moved forward. And that's all that happened. But I didn't put my hand for some reason. There was, because one of the first things they do when they find people who have fallen flat on their face is take x-rays of their hands and wrists. But there was nothing wrong with them. Didn't feel anything because I was reaching out to something, I think. So I actually smacked onto the tarmac, really hot tarmac. It was a really hot day. Bam. Um, and I was surrounded by people immediately, and they were all giving me a lot of care. And there is an issue with the adrenal insufficiency. Stress can cause it can actually within 45 minutes lead to death if you're very unlucky. And that's on your mind when something like that happens. So all that's going on for me. And people call an ambulance, the people around me, as, ooh, there's a lot of blood here, and, Um, and I'm thinking, these ambulance men are going to have a laugh, aren't they? I mean, I just stumbled and fell and they need to call an ambulance. That's what's going through my mind. And my husband, who's watching, well, I hope he's still watching, he's not written anything, um, gets very frustrated with me for doing that because every single time, and we have been to emergency departments often. I was going to say regularly, it's not regular as clockwork, thankfully, but I mean, the mere term emergency, it's urgent at that stage. It's something that happens pretty quickly and unexpectedly and is bad. And every single time I'm thinking, they won't find anything wrong with me. I'll just be sent home. I might as well just stay home. No, there's dangers attached to that. And clearly, as Tina wrote earlier on, I am not alone. Um, People who have been severely medically gaslit take risks with their own health because of imposter syndrome. I had somebody write, I said it before, that the day of diagnosis, the day of real diagnosis, what went through them was, are you sure? That can't be right because it's all in my head. I've heard of people who are actually relieved to get a diagnosis of MS. It's not something that you'd think that somebody could feel relieved about, but by comparison to what they've been through, by the fact that there's answers there, you know, that's how far that's the consequences. Um, People doubt the severity of their own medical condition. And adrenal insufficiency is a brilliant example of that because with adrenal insufficiency, you lack cortisol. Your body doesn't produce cortisol as it should, which can be life-threatening very quickly. You need it to live. And most people who do not have anything wrong with their adrenal glands have a high level of cortisol in the morning, lower level in the evening, but during the day your body will adjust according to your stress levels because you need more when you're stressed. So in people with whose body doesn't, because then you get medicated, you get the cortisol given from outside, which actually stops your body producing the little bit that it had been still producing before. So what happens is that we go into adrenal crisis if we don't adjust correctly. And then the discussion is, well, what is stress? And at how much stress do you have to take? How much cortisol? And is that same for everyone or is it different? And so on and so forth. And we have learnt to doubt what our body is telling us through a hard regime. And a lot of people with adrenal insufficiency will dose too low or too late, and we lose people by it. People become anxious of going to doctors and therapists. There's a suspicion that remains even after, because I certainly felt the change in mood and in approach towards me as soon as I could actually say, I have got adrenal insufficiency, and a bit later I have got lupus, and a bit later I have got Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it had been proven in two separate university hospitals, so there really wasn't a coming back from that. Suddenly I was treated with a lot more care and a lot more respect and a lot more understanding and a lot more trust. But I didn't trust it. And I am still very careful. But I found ways around that. I found ways of checking. I get the doctors to jump through hoops now instead of them getting me to jump through hoops. If they don't hit the marks, I'm going to a different one. And we have that luxury in Belgium. And it really is a privilege. Um, but you're severely ill and you fear doctors and therapists, assuming that there's something psychologically wrong with you. It stops people from going for the help that they actually need. I will come back to reading what you're writing, Tina, but I'm aware it's there. No, 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 do write. I really appreciate it. Shows me you're engaged. Um, the other thing is that when you've been misdiagnosed, I mean, ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, in a way, and if there's a lot of ME/CFS patients in the audience, I will probably not be supported by saying that, but it's relatively mild. People get all sorts of psychiatric diagnoses that are incorrect. Borderline is a typical one. And they do get told later, once they have the proper diagnosis, once we know what's wrong with their bodies, they get told that that was wrong, that they should never have had that. They get told it by psychiatrists, by people who are in the know. But it stays on their file. So the suspicious nature that they have adopted is actually justified, because anybody looking in their file will see them. There's a potential that anybody looking in their file will continue to see them as a psychiatric patient, which might, and often does, stop them searching for answers that are grounded in biomedical issues. And again, there's risks and danger attached to that. People always remain vulnerable to abuse and maltreatment once they've been through it. And so people are left with a lot of sadness, a lot of grieving to do, bitterness. I'm sure you've heard some of it come through. I try to keep it under control. Actually, it is reasonably well under control, but being in the throes of it, and as I said, it's been heartbreaking to read everybody's stories. The anger, even though I have gained understanding of where it might have come from, I think that I did come across people who were just too keen on power, or who had other motivations. But I think on the whole, the intention may not have been as bad as the effect that they had. And people are left hurt. But importantly, all that causes genuine mental health issues like post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people who have been gaslit medically end up with PTSD because of it. That's directly related to it. Anxiety, depression, they're all very real. And so you get into a vicious circle because you're proving their point. How do you break that? And so a patient who's been through that and been left with that, when they go to any practitioner that is new to them, they go in with all that baggage on top of the physical conditions that they have. And I doubt it, but I really do hope that there's people in the audience who are in that role. Because actually, I have been enormously helped by the practitioners who got it. And often they've been people who had never heard of EDS before, and most of my issues nowadays relate to EDS, which isn't, no, it's too complicated to explain, but anyway, my body doesn't fit together like it should. That's the really brief explanation of it. So it will always be issues. I can do what I can and they can do what they can. But largely it's a case of learning to live with it. And when people get that diagnosis, that's exactly what they get told. You will have to learn to live with it. But I've come across people, even like, for example, my podologist. She says she's never heard of EDS before she met me, and recently she said somebody came to visit her and she told her about EDS and look into it because I think that might be what you have. But just the way that she seemed to understand that every time I came to her and said that really hurts, I needed her to validate that. I needed her to say, yeah, but it looks red as well. I mean, having EDS, I'm very, very flexible, but reaching my toes is really difficult. And so actually seeing that my toes are red in a small space is not so obvious for me. So every time she did, we need that validation. And when we get it initially, there's shock, there's disbelief at being listened to, at being respected, at being treated well, at being cared for. I actually clearly remember my very first experience of that. And I had been lucky, I've told you this, I was lucky with family doctor who didn't know of these conditions, but he did everything he could. He was always very respectful of me. You know, I have no issue with him. But that was different to the very first experience of I needed a back operation. I was admitted with it, and the nursing staff came to my bed and looked through my file. Here we go. And they said, whew, you've been through a lot, haven't you? And without saying it, they said, we're going to take care of you. And they did consistently, the whole team. That's rare. There's always one. And the memory of it is clear as day. And it's about 10 years ago. It was before I had the EDS diagnosis, and it was actually related to it. So that's something that someone wrote to me as well, that they were surprised to experience that they were deserving of help. Imagine that. That is real for many of us. The idea that we're not deserving of help because we have the audacity to have a body that won't do as it's told. My illness is my fault. And I always objected to that. Somehow I was resistive. She was right. I was very resistive. Um, I somehow, despite all that questioning and all that digging, I somehow managed to cling on to there is something else wrong here, And I was able to sift through, to filter that some of the things they were suggesting weren't right for me. I had are they called psychologic nurses? Or a nurse with psychology training. And she really wanted to talk me into feeling bad about using a wheelchair. And she went every way she could think to try and get that out of me. And I kept saying, no, I'm happy that I've got a wheelchair because now I can go to the Christmas market because I've got a friend who's going to push me. And otherwise I won't be able to go. And I'll still suffer for it, but I just wouldn't be able to go at all if I didn't have the wheelchair. Um, and I did resist. And what made me resist was that what I recognized was that I am responsible for getting my quality of life to the best level. I'm responsible for living my best life. Is very different from my illness is my fault. Another thing that someone wrote to me was how exhausted they get. And exhaustion, in a lot of these people's cases, actually is one of the main symptoms. And for me, it was the primary symptom, but it's often there when you're going through that kind of story. And they were getting exhausted of having to defend a complex set of circumstances. You have to explain it constantly. And that goes on after. When you get a diagnosis like EDS, and we went into accidents and emergency once, and the doctor came back to us. He'd already been to us, came back to us, and he said, "What was that thing called again that you had?" And he wrote it on his hand. He said, "I'm going to go, I'm writing it on my hand so I can go and look it up on the internet." You know. Indeed, exhaustion and pain and exhaustion and round and round and round. And then you have to explain it to them and hope and somehow find a midget of trust left in you that they're going to listen and take it seriously and that they're going to recognize that in this case, you're the specialist. It's a difficult one. It's a sensitive subject for a lot of doctors and health professionals. Another thing that you get is that people have gotten used to constantly masking, using really extreme coping skills, compensating, the survival strategies. And I really like it. It passes through Facebook every now and again. These things kind of do the rounds, these memes and sayings and whatever. And I particularly like this one. You think I pretend to be ill when all my life I've been pretending to be well. And that is very much the case for a lot of patients out there. And the way I explain that, and it's not my own explanation, it's something, again, I read somewhere, but I read that years ago and it really helped me. And it helps me to explain it simply. When you're well and you get the flu and you feel rotten, you can behave rotten for a few days. Everyone will forgive you for being grumpy and short and, I just feel it. It's part of sick role. If you constantly feel like that and you start doing that, I mean, the isolation that you're already in is not going to improve your situation if you behave like that. You have to stay chirpy. You have to find a way of just being able to still continue to connect with people. One way or another, even if you're very introvert, there's still connections to be made. You know. And isolation, I just mentioned it, You can imagine. It's massive. And mine was broken when I met my husband, who one of the very first things he said to me when we met and started talking properly was, "I don't believe in ME." And to this day, he says, "I was right, wasn't I?" And he was. He didn't mean it in that sense. He meant it. He actually was very honest and said, "That opinion is only based on the things I have read and seen in the media." Um, and that's exactly what happened. That things were things do get a cultural platform. It the examples that I have given, the consequences as well as the examples of what actually happens, are very individual things. There's generalizations there. There's individual things that happen individually to different people. But there's also a cultural and a political base. And that is very different and is much more frightening. Um, and I know Eric is particularly up on that. Um, I kind of feel that that's beyond the scope of tonight's talk. It will take us too far. Um, but bear it in mind, and we can always cover it some other time. But that I would need to do a lot of research for. I need uh, much more time to plan for that. Um, Another consequence, because it is often the case with genetic disorders, not always, but it does seem to be so. People wonder about what's going to happen to our kids. They tend to know earlier. Will that save them from lack of understanding, from stigma, from abuse? Let me tell you from experience, I have a 16-year-old boy who I've been very generous to with all my bad genes, including the ones that I'm actually only a carrier for and have barely any symptoms from. The answer is no, sadly. It's a lot less, but it's still there. And in any case, genetic or not, parents often get blamed for their children being so ill. And that's a whole other. We've been spared of that largely. Um, Again, privilege. Parents get diagnoses of Munchausen's by proxy before the child has had all the investigations that should occur. And once the parents have had that diagnosis, the children aren't investigated any further. The conditions, it delays. They get blamed for psychologically abusing their children, for poor parenting. I mean, one of the things that I was very consistently told was I didn't have enough attention as a child. And that's pointing the finger at me. I'm only ill because I need the attention, but it's also pointing the finger at my parents. They did it wrong. They suffered as well. I'm sure they questioned themselves over it. Um, how could they not? Now, all this leads to situations. I'm going to share an example. Someone wrote to me um, in great detail. I'm going to keep it as brief, very brief compared to the detail that she wrote to me. She'd been through many years also of medical gaslighting, and she had an incident where something went wrong with her shoulder and she was in excruciating pain. And her files too still said that she had borderline. And she went to accident and emergency, and twice she was sent home. even though she was screaming in pain, asking for specific investigations to be done, MRI scan. She was told it couldn't be that bad. And eventually she was admitted and she ended up having 3 operations. That's happening today. I mean, that is a very recent story. And the worst of it is that it leads to death. It leads to death through suicide. I remember a conversation I had with one of my consultants where I said, I'm pretty sure the system is designed to gear us towards suicide because once we've died, we're no longer a cost to society. Well, I can't say how true that is, but it certainly is how I felt at the time. And there will always be that niggle. But the other thing is the worsening of underlying physical conditions because it's discovered too late. There's nothing to be done anymore when it could have been. And worse of all, people die in psychiatric wards, get an autopsy afterwards, and it turns out that they had neurodegenerative diseases, that they had infections. One person, I don't think they were admitted to psychiatry, but certainly they had their integrity and their character questioned for being ill, and it turned out it was a form of epilepsy. And when they did have a fall, because they did have a real a real seizure, a kind of what all the others will have been real as well. A seizure in the way that we know them, and they fell and they died. Could have been prevented. And a particular one apparently is dorsal root ganglia inflammation. And there have been a couple of famous cases of people, being seen and treated as a psychiatric patient, which in itself shouldn't be a bad thing. One, if there is psychiatric issues going on, it's good that we have it. But also if it's done with necessary care and respect. And I have to admit to having been one of the people who, in my training as an OT in the early 90s, laughed at the thought when somebody suggested, you have people with psychoses and severe depression or whatever, and then you have the worried well. And I belonged to that group. Now, for me, it changed. It didn't change overnight. It's been 10 years since things started to change for me. But I continued to be stuck with the consequences that we've been through. Not all of them, but a good deal of them. And not only me, but my husband, my child, those close to me, those who carry me in their heart, suffered along. There's no questioning that. And then things changed. Just a couple of years ago, roughly. A friend of mine, who is a psychologist, had offered years before, I think about 6 years before that, she said, perhaps I could give you a few sessions. And we were both, we didn't particularly like each other at that time, but we were part of a community, and she felt this was something she could offer and that she should offer. That was, her discernment. And the first session, we both kind of said, this isn't going to work, but let's try it. in more words than that. And she ended up being my psychologist for 8 years, I think, in total. And she did a lot of work with me on self compassion, and, she identified a lot of the things that I kept raising as being at least problematic, that I had been treated like I should have been treated better by her former colleagues, among others. Um, Somehow I had another operation, an urgent one, uh, and I was told, there was a threat of cancer in my body. It wasn't cancer yet, but it needed to be taken out, and I wouldn't feel any different, and it would all be all right, and it was just a technical thing, and it wasn't. I was really, I'd really gone backwards in terms of health. I was so poorly. I went to my GP and I said, I need to be admitted. I'm not well. And he refused. And my physio, my nurse, my key worker, they were all shocked. They were all convinced that I should be admitted somewhere, but how, who, and the way my family doctor at the time put it was, you fall under so many different specialties, and within any one of them, you're not ill enough, so I wouldn't know who to ask to admit you. And as luck would have it, we happened past a place that in big signs said it was a rehabilitation hospital, physical rehabilitation. I thought that's the place for me. Got home, looked it up on the internet, and I thought I could go there. That could be meaningful for me. They might have something to offer that will meet my needs. But I needed a doctor to sign the referral form. And I was seeing my neurosurgeon a few months later, so I had this in mind, took the papers with me, had him sign them, and I remember him saying, "Yeah, I'm happy to sign that, and I'm sure they really could be of help to you, but they won't admit you because it's been too long ago since you had an operation." So I had my signed form, I rang them, and I explained the situation. She said, "Send me the form. I can't answer the question because I'm a secretary here, can't speak for the doctors. But what I do know is if you send me the form and you send me as many reports as possible and explain the situation, um, they will consider it." And within a few days, I had an answer saying, "Please come for a consultation with the head doctor in this hospital." You can imagine what that would do to me, having heard what I've told you, and many of you having experienced it for yourself. Straight to the head doctor, without much support from anyone else. I decided I wanted this. And I spoke with my psychologist about this, and she prepared me. Something changed, something clicked that said to me, if they can't offer me what I need, I don't want what they've got to offer. So, you know, I'm going in, I'm saying what I feel my need is and why, and if they can meet that and they would want to, then I'll go in. And if the answer is no, then they don't have anything that could be of help to me anyway. That's disappointing, but that's how it is. So my husband took me there, went in with me, and I had this wonderful conversation with this doctor who, at the very end, it took me to the very end of the conversation before I started to show a little bit of the distrust I had gone in with, or at least the worries I had gone in with. And he said, "I really don't care what is causing what you're going through. You're going through it, and we might be able to help you. And if we can't, we'll find out. Let's try." I thought that was fantastic. I thought, isn't that what the Hippocratic Oath is supposed to be about? And they changed my life. And I'm still very ill, and still have to take medication and whatever else. Um, but it changed so much. the experience of that conversation with him, the experience of the psychologist preparing me for it and me making that click, but also the actual rehabilitation. Um, I still only have 4 to 5 functional hours a day. Let that be clear. But the quality of those hours has improved drastically. I still have to be careful how I use them. I have learned how to listen to my body for the first time in my life. And the way I learned it was that over there, while I was in hospital, in this rehabilitation place, the therapists also kept saying, you need to listen to your body. It's become very in now, isn't it? You have to listen to your body. And I said repeatedly to whoever said it to me, my answer was, well, if I do that, I will just stay in bed all day. That's how I feel. That's how I felt. As far as I can remember, that can't be the point of being here. And they agreed that it wasn't, but what to do? And the psychologist there said the same thing, and I said the same thing, and she said, ah, well, then you shouldn't listen to your body. Then you should use your intelligence. Do you mean she listened to me? She heard what I was saying. I can't do it by listening to my body. And together we worked out a plan of how we were going to use my intelligence instead. And it worked. And it still works. Um, and then things followed from that. And I had another operation in December where my neck was up. I've got a war wound to show, which is healing well. But you know, I went back. I asked to go back to the rehabilitation place, to the hospital there, after I'd had the operation, and it was all arranged, and they knew me there, and it all went well. Um, but that's where I started preparing for the book, and one of the things about writing my memoir about medical gaslighting was that it was a real decision. It wasn't, I'm just going to start writing something, and after a couple of pages, I'll put it to one side and I'll go back to it in a few weeks' time, but never do. No, I wanted this seriously. It felt like a calling, and it still does. Um, and to do so, I had a look on the internet, found some free courses about how to start really writing a book. And one of the things was to create a vision, which I've done. And I'm doing this, which I'm going to go back to the vision and see what I wrote because it's in there somewhere. And it certainly isn't within the first 3 months or 4 months. I cheat myself. Um, and from that, I learned that I should set up a Facebook page, and I did. And all these things scared me. And all these things I thought, just do them. What have I got to lose? Time and effort. That's it. Let's just do them. And it's kind of it's like a snowball rolling down a mountain. It's just getting bigger and bigger. And I get so much trust from people. People confide, not only confide, but actually allow me to use their stories as necessary, use their words. And I have been deeply moved by everything that's been happening since. And it is extremely motivating. And I hope I can be a voice so that I'm going to go back and restart what I was saying. Last weekend, somebody was talking about within a community that they're part of, somebody had died. And it was a sad thing to hear. It was upsetting. There was a bit of commotion within the community. But then she found out it was someone that she didn't know very personally, but she knew of. She knew their name. She knew their occupation. That they had children, whatever. And she said suddenly it changed because this person had a name. I could imagine somebody going through that. I was thinking of what's going to happen to their business, what's going to happen to their children, you know. And she said that there is no answer to how we overcome that, but having a name, having a person that you feel you know makes a difference in how much compassion you can bring to the table. I'm saying it in my own words. That's how I understood it. And I thought, yeah, that's what we need. We don't have that. Medical gaslighting is talked about amongst patients and only little because it's embarrassing. It's shame. But we are starting to do that. We are starting to trust each other at least. But it needs to be brought to light. It needs to be known. It needs to move people. And for that to be the case, it needs to be happening to a person that they can relate with. And I feel called to be one of those people that makes the them, that gives the them a name. So I'm going to have a read because a lot has been written here, which I'm very pleased to see. I've obviously brought something about something I forgot to touch on, and I should have done at the start really, was talking about bringing it to light, becoming that person that raises their voice about it. Opens a lot of wounds for people, and I'm very aware of that. But we need to push the pus out, you know. So I try to do it as sensitively as I think I can, and I'm always willing to learn. Know that. So I'm going to take time to read what you've written and see if I can add anything or respond in any way. Oh, I can only go back. I can't go back very far. Yeah, I think the point that you're raising is an important one, that to me, true science is asking questions. The way my son says it, and I apologize, he's 16-year-old. I apologize for the language. If you don't want to hear it, stick your fingers in your ear. But he says, science, it's fuck around and find out. Um, and really, that's what it should be. But a lot of qualified people seem to feel that science is knowing everything and that they already know everything there is to know, and don't need to learn, let alone learn from people that they are above, that they are responsible for. So, yeah, and I see what you're writing. I hope understanding that it happened to you helps, and helps you go through the grieving, and finding new ways forward. Yeah, that's another thing that I didn't write in the consequences. A lot of patients get seen as pill chasers when they ask for pain meds or when they ask for cortisol, and when doctors aren't aware of such a condition like adrenal insufficiency. There's a lot attached to that again, the scope for this evening isn't wide, and I'm aware of the time. But it's a very important point that you've raised there, Tina. Thank you. Oh, thank you for the hug, Tina. Hope you're still there. You can have one back. Since I had my neck operated, I can hug again. And I see you've made connections through this video, so that those things mean so much to me. They really do. Ah, that's good to know about you, Yo. Yo's a friend of ours. I just, if people are wondering why I'm saying that, um, I can take that into account. Your idea, Eric, about coming together and commissioning a sociological study. When I studied occupational therapy, we had an assessment called the personal professional profile, I think. IPP, individual personal profile or professional profile. Anyway, it looked at how we interacted with people, whether we had the kind of capacity that's never assessed and that you do need in a therapist. I remember one of the things in it was achieves appropriate responses from others, and we always laughed at that. Like, how can I be assessed on whether I can get the appropriate response from whoever's in front of me? Although we understood how you could, but it just went really far. And if you failed to one after the other, that was it. You were finished. You weren't studying occupational therapy anymore. Um, and so at the end of the course, when we had to do our, in Dutch it's called thesis, but it wasn't called that in English. But the big, the, um, the study at the end, um, I decided to look at the IPP and find out whether our tutors were good role models and whether they should be. Um, it feels related to that. Just thought I'd share that with you. Those are the only comments I get to see at the moment. I hope when we finish off and I can go back to the live video, because this will be posted automatically so that you can go back as if you would want to, but you can't go back and um, watch it again, listen to it, but you can also refer other people if you thought it was worthwhile. But it means you should be able to read all the comments there as well. I hope I can, because I would love to know. Are there any other questions, thoughts, anything you want to share with me or with the group? I will wait for a while because there's a lag between me speaking and you receiving, I think, as well. But certainly you writing and me being able to read it. My word salads. I love that. Today I saw a thing of, I, having started all this, I'm now part of these groups of writers and authors, and there's fun things happening there in that world as well. And there was a meme or see, I'm an old woman. I don't know what the right word is for the right, Again, my teenager gets quite frustrated at me calling gifs memes and whatever. But it said something like, "How do you write? How do you start to write a book, or how do you write a book?" Um, you take the alphabet and you mix it round was the first step.